His name was Thomas, not the name his colleagues knew him by, not the name on the security badge he wore every morning into one of the most sensitive facilities in Western Europe, but the name he gave to the man who had been buying him coffee every Thursday for months. The coffee shop was 3 blocks from the facility. Unremarkable. The kind of place that exists in every city in every country, where the tables are slightly close together and the background noise is just loud enough to make the conversation at your table feel private. Thomas had discovered it 6 weeks after his transfer, when the city was still unfamiliar and the evenings still felt longer than they should. He had gone there because it was warm and because his apartment, a temporary furnished rental that his employer had arranged, felt like a waiting room. He had not yet figured out how to leave. He had met the man he knew as Richard on a Tuesday, not a Thursday. Richard had asked if the chair across from Thomas was taken. It was not. The conversation that followed lasted 20 minutes and covered nothing significant. Books, the city, a film that had recently been released. The kind of conversation that people have when neither of them is trying to get anywhere in particular and both of them simply want the company. Thomas had thought about the conversation afterward, not because anything remarkable was said, but because of how it felt to have said anything at all to someone who was not a colleague, or a security official, or a landlord. He had been in the city for 6 weeks. That conversation was the first one he had chosen rather than required. When Richard appeared again the following Thursday, Thomas noticed, when Richard suggested, casually, that he was in the area most Thursday mornings and that the coffee here was better than anywhere else nearby. Thomas did not analyze the suggestion. He simply filed it as good information. The following Thursday, he arrived at the same time Richard had been there the previous week. They talked for 40 minutes. The Thursday after that, an hour. By the 4th month, Thomas's Thursdays had a shape they had not had before. There was something to anticipate. Someone who asked him questions that were not about his work, who remembered the answers he had given to previous questions, who laughed at the same kinds of things he laughed at, and seemed genuinely interested in the specific texture of his opinions, rather than simply their professional conclusions. Someone who had, without either of them apparently deciding that this was what was happening, become the most consistent human presence in his week. Thomas had not told anyone at the facility about Richard, not because he was hiding anything, at least not in any way he was consciously aware of, but because the friendship, if that was what it was, existed in a part of his life that felt separate from the professional world he inhabited from Monday to Friday. It felt like his. In a life that had been progressively narrowed by security clearances and relocation requirements, and the particular social isolation that comes with working in environments where you cannot discuss what occupies most of your waking hours. Richard felt like the part of his life that belonged to him rather than to the institution. Richard's real name was not Richard. His real employer was not the consulting firm he had mentioned. And the Thursday coffee shop appearances had not begun with a coincidence on a Tuesday. They had begun with a file that described, in careful clinical detail, a man whose security clearance made him professionally valuable, and whose personal circumstances made him, in the specific language of that file, an isolation profile, a subject whose loneliness was not a personal failing but an operational opportunity. Thomas was not targeted because of what he knew. He was targeted because of how alone he was while knowing it. Most people who think about intelligence recruitment think about it in terms of leverage, blackmail, ideology, financial incentive, coercion. The dramatic mechanics of someone being pressured or persuaded into betraying what they are supposed to protect. Those methods exist, and they have been used throughout the history of espionage with documented effectiveness, but they share a significant operational disadvantage. They require the target to know, on some level, that they are being recruited. The transaction is visible even when it is unwilling. The target understands what is happening and makes a choice, however constrained that choice might be. the most effective human intelligence recruitment in the documented history of espionage, does not work that way. It does not require coercion or financial desperation or ideological conversion. It requires something far simpler and far more available. It requires a person who is lonely enough that genuine human connection, when it finally arrives, is experienced with a depth of gratitude and attachment that overrides the professional judgment that would otherwise protect them. Loneliness is not a character weakness that intelligence agencies exploit in people who are somehow deficient. It is a structural condition that the environment surrounding high-value intelligence targets reliably produce. Security clearances isolate. Relocation requirements sever existing relationships. The professional cultures of sensitive facilities actively discourage the kind of openness that sustains friendship. The very conditions that make someone a high-value target access to sensitive information. Immersion in classified environments, the habits of professional discretion, are the same conditions that progressively narrow a person's social world until the arrival of genuine human warmth from any direction is experienced not as suspicious but as relief. Intelligence services understand this with a precision that most people would find deeply uncomfortable if they understood it fully. They do not wait for targets to become lonely. They profile for existing loneliness. They identify individuals whose social circumstances already contain the specific kind of isolation that makes the engineered arrival of connection feel like something the universe has finally provided rather than something an agency has deliberately deployed. And then they position someone in that isolation with the patience and precision of a process that has been refined across decades of operational experience. What we are going to examine today is how the process works from the inside, what the specific psychological mechanics are that make loneliness such a reliable operational vector, and what it reveals about human connection and human vulnerability. That these operations succeed as consistently as they do against people who are, in every other professional respect, among the most security-conscious individuals in the world. Because this is not a story about people who were naive or careless or ideologically compromised. It is a story about people who were human, who needed what all human beings need, and who encountered, in a precisely engineered form, exactly what they needed at exactly the moment their defenses were lowest. By the end of this, you will not look at loneliness the same way, and you will not look at the people who arrive to relieve it the same way either. Before we go deeper, think about a specific period of your own life when you were genuinely isolated, not dramatically alone, not in crisis, just in that particular state of low-level social scarcity that most people experience at some point. A new city, a new job, a life transition that left the old social infrastructure behind before the new one had been built. The particular quiet of evenings that feel longer than they used to. The way a conversation with a stranger can feel disproportionately significant in those periods, simply because of its scarcity. Now think about who entered your life during that period, who appeared when the social landscape around you was emptiest, who became important to you with a speed and depth that might have seemed surprising in a different context but felt completely natural in that one. And think honestly about how thoroughly you examined the circumstances of their arrival versus how thoroughly you simply felt grateful for it. Most people, in periods of genuine isolation, do not scrutinize the people who relieve it. They experience relief, and relief does not generate suspicion. It generates attachment, gratitude, the particular loyalty that forms toward people who showed up when the landscape was empty. Because what you experienced in that moment, that accelerated sense of significance, that disproportionate attachment to someone who arrived when the landscape was empty, is precisely the psychological condition that the operations we are discussing today are specifically designed to produce, not because lonely people are weak, but because the human need for connection is strong enough that when it has been suppressed long enough, its relief produces a response that is neurologically and emotionally indistinguishable from the most genuine attachment any of us ever form. Before any human contact is initiated in an operation that uses loneliness as its primary vector, an intelligence service constructs what analysts in this field refer to as an isolation profile. This is not simply a record of how socially active or inactive a target currently appears to be. It is a detailed map of the specific nature, depth, and origin of their isolation, because not all loneliness operates the same way, and not all of it is equally exploitable for intelligence purposes. The isolation profile begins with what analysts call structural loneliness assessment. This examines the external conditions of the target's life to identify whether their isolation is situational or habitual. Situational isolation, the kind produced by relocation, career transition, or the dissolution of a significant relationship, is operationally more valuable than habitual isolation. For a specific reason, a person who has always been somewhat isolated has typically developed psychological accommodation to that state. They have built internal resources, solitary habits, self-sufficiency practices that reduce their active hunger for connection. A person who was previously well connected and has recently become isolated carries something different and operationally more significant. They carry the memory of what full social engagement felt like. They are not adapted to their current state. They are in a condition of unmet need that is active rather than dormant. The profile then examines what intelligence psychologists call connection architecture, the specific forms of social engagement that the target has lost or lacks and that they are most likely to respond to when those forms are offered. Some isolated individuals are most acutely missing intellectual engagement, the experience of discussing ideas with someone who finds the same things interesting. Others are missing emotional intimacy, the experience of being known rather than simply professionally recognized. Others are missing the particular texture of easy, undemanding companionship, the experience of simply being in the same space as another person without any professional or social performance being required. Each of these forms of missing connection represents a different operational entry point. The operative positioned against an intellectually starved target presents differently from the operative positioned against someone craving emotional recognition. The research that precedes the contact determines which form of connection will feel most like relief to this specific person and calibrates the operative as presented identity accordingly. The profile also examines the target's security awareness in the specific context of their personal life. Many high-value targets maintain extraordinary professional vigilance. They follow security protocols. They are alert to technical surveillance. They are trained to recognize certain categories of approach in professional contexts. But that vigilance is typically calibrated for professional environments, the personal life, precisely because it feels like the domain that belongs to them rather than the institution, is where professional guard is lowest. It is where a relationship can develop to a depth of genuine trust before it ever touches anything the target consciously considers sensitive. This asymmetry between professional and personal vigilance is one of the most consistently exploited features of the isolation-based recruitment approach. The target does not apply the same scrutiny to the person who becomes their Thursday coffee companion that they apply to an unfamiliar email or an unusual request from a new colleague, because the coffee companion belongs to the personal world, and the personal world feels safe precisely because it feels like the one place that their professional security training does not need to govern. The isolation profile identifies all of this before the operation begins. The operative who eventually makes contact does not arrive at random. They arrive at the precise coordinates that the profile has identified as most likely to produce the experience of genuine relief. Understanding why loneliness-based recruitment operations work as consistently as they do against psychologically sophisticated and professionally security-conscious individuals requires understanding something specific about what chronic social isolation does to the brain over time, and how that neurological state changes the way a person processes new connection when it finally arrives. Human beings are among the most socially dependent organisms in existence. The need for consistent social connection is not a preference or a personality trait, but a biological requirement. Neuroscientific research has consistently demonstrated that chronic loneliness produces measurable changes in brain function, specifically in the regions governing threat assessment, trust evaluation, and reward response, and those changes create a psychological state that is, from an operational standpoint, precisely the opposite of what most people assume isolation produces. Most people assume that a lonely person becomes more suspicious of new connection because they have had less recent experience of it. The neurological reality is the opposite. Chronic loneliness suppresses the activity of the brain as threat evaluation systems and social context and simultaneously heightens the reward response to positive social stimuli. A person who has been isolated for an extended period does not become more cautious about new relationships. They become, at a neurological level, more responsive to them, more likely to register warmth as significant, more likely to experience connection as meaningful, more likely to attach quickly and deeply to someone who relieves the isolation, because the relief itself is experienced as neurologically rewarding in a way the connection is not. When social needs are already being met, this is what makes the isolation vector so operationally powerful. The target's own nervous system becomes an amplifier for the engineered connection. The operative does not need to manufacture an unusually compelling relationship. They need to manufacture an adequately warm one and allow the target as own neurological state to do the rest of the work. The loneliness makes the ordinary feel extraordinary. The scarcity makes the available feel precious. The isolation makes the arrival of consistent human warmth feel, over time, like something that cannot be risked or endangered. And the last element is where the operational leverage eventually appears. Because a person who has experienced genuine isolation and then experienced genuine relief from it carries a specific fear that they did not carry before. The fear of returning to the state they were in before the connection arrived. That fear does not announce itself as a vulnerability. It presents as loyalty, as attachment, as the natural human resistance to losing something that has become important. But from the operative side, it represents the moment when the relationship has developed enough weight that the target will do things to protect it that they would not otherwise do. This is the architecture of the approach at its most sophisticated level. The operative is not asking for anything in the early stages. They are giving, consistently, generously, without apparent agenda. They are filling a space that was empty and making themselves indispensable to the target's sense of ordinary well-being. And when the target has reorganized their emotional life around the presence of this person, when the relationship has become one of the structural pillars of how their week feels and how they understand themselves in the world, the operative has access to something no technical collection method can replicate. The target's active desire to preserve a relationship that has become genuinely important to them. Thomas did not betray his clearance because he was pressured. He did so because he could not imagine returning to the Thursday mornings before Richard, and that inability was not a failure of his character. It was the entirely predictable outcome of a process designed specifically to produce it. Here is the dimension of loneliness. Based intelligence operations that almost no public discussion of this subject reaches, and that represents perhaps the most unsettling truth in this entire area of tradecraft. Intelligence agencies do not only exploit existing loneliness in some documented operational contexts, they have been involved in actively contributing to the conditions that produce it. This does not require dramatic intervention. It does not require visible sabotage of a target's social life or any action that would be recognizable as hostile. It requires only the quiet, patient management of environmental factors that the agency already has significant influence over, specifically in cases where the target works within an institutional context that the agency has some relationship with or leverage over. Consider what the conditions surrounding a high-value target actually look like in practice. Relocation requirements that move them away from established social networks, security protocols that restrict what they can discuss in any social environment, and therefore make authentic friendship difficult to sustain. Professional cultures that reward discretion and self-containment. Transfer schedules that prevent any single posting from lasting long enough for deep social roots to form. These conditions are all operationally justified. They serve genuine security purposes, but they also produce, reliably and predictably, exactly the kind of structural isolation that makes a target most vulnerable to the approach. This video describes an intelligence service that understands this, and the most sophisticated ones understand it in considerable operational depth. Does not need to manufacture loneliness from outside. It simply needs to allow the institutional conditions surrounding a target to do what those conditions naturally do, which is progressively narrow the target as social world, until the space where an engineered connection can be inserted is already open and waiting. In more active documented cases, analysts have identified what they describe as social friction operations. Low-level interventions in a target as peripheral social environment designed to create distance between and the target and their existing connections without any single intervention being large enough to register as hostile. A piece of information that reaches a friend of the target and creates mild but unresolved tension. A professional circumstance that makes socializing with colleagues slightly more complicated than it was previously. A series of small environmental pressures that individually explain themselves as ordinary life friction, but cumulatively nudge the target toward a state of greater social scarcity. By the time the operative makes their appearance, the target does not experience it as the conclusion of a process. They experience it as good fortune arriving in a difficult period. The timing that feels so fortunate is not accidental. The difficult period that makes the fortune feel so significant was not entirely accidental either. This represents a level of operational patience and systemic thinking that most public discussions of espionage never reach because the evidence for it is diffuse and the mechanisms are deniable. Each individual element of the process is explicable as coincidence or ordinary institutional behavior. The pattern only becomes visible in retrospect, usually in the debriefs that follow a recruitment being uncovered, where the target can trace back through the preceding months and begin to see the shape of what was arranged around them before the relationship that defined that period ever began. The most important truth this reveals about the loneliness vector is that it is not reactive. It does not wait for targets to become isolated and then move in. At its most sophisticated level, it is generative. It identifies targets and then patiently contributes to the conditions that will make them most ready to receive exactly what is coming. You have never been the subject of an isolation profile. You have never had an intelligence service quietly managing the peripheral conditions of your social life to produce a state of greater vulnerability. The operations described in this video are directed at a very specific category of person in very specific professional circumstances, and the probability that you are among them is low. But the psychological mechanisms that make these operations work are not specific to intelligence targets. They are universal features of human social experience, and recognizing them in the extreme context of intelligence tradecraft makes them easier to identify in the quieter contexts where they appear in ordinary life. Think about the people in your own history who arrived during your envious periods, who showed up when the social landscape was sparse and positioned themselves as consistent, warm, reliably available, who became important to you with a speed that felt organic but that you might now recognize as partly a function of the timing rather than purely the person. And think about whether, in any of those relationships, you made decisions to protect or preserve the connection that you would not have made if your social world had been full. When the person arrived, most of us have done this. Most of us have extended trust more quickly, disclosed more openly, overlooked things we might otherwise have examined more carefully, because someone arrived when we needed someone to arrive, and the relief of their arrival shaped how we related to everything that followed. That is not a failure of judgment. It is a feature of human attachment that operates the same way regardless of whether the person who arrived planned their arrival or simply happened to be there. What the intelligence context makes visible with unusual clarity is the degree to which the felt experience of organic connection can be produced through design circumstances. The warmth is real. The relief is real. The attachment that forms is real. None of those things require the circumstances that produce them to have been accidental. Understanding this does not mean approaching new relationships with suspicion. It means approaching them with a specific kind of attention. Attention to timing. Attention to what was absent in your life when a particular person appeared. Attention to whether your assessment of a person was formed in conditions of social abundance or social scarcity, because those contexts do not produce the same quality of judgment. And the difference between them is something the most sophisticated operational planners in the world have understood and relied on for a very long time. Intelligence professionals operating in the loneliness vector have developed 3 specific methods that determine how the engineered connection is established and sustained at each stage of the operation. These methods are behavioral and psychological in nature, and understanding them changes how you read the development of any relationship that began during a period of social scarcity. The first method is called need mirroring. Before any contact is made, the isolation profile has identified the specific form of connection that the target is most acutely missing. The operative does not present as a generically warm or friendly person. They present as precisely the kind of person who addresses the target's specific unmet need. If the target is intellectually isolated, the operative is a stimulating conversationalist who finds the target's specific area of expertise genuinely fascinating. If the target is emotionally isolated, the operative is an unusually attentive listener who asks questions that demonstrate real interest in the target as a person rather than as a professional. If the target is simply missing easy companionship, the operative is low demand, consistently available, and comfortable with the kind of unstructured time together that feels like rest, rather than social performance. The precision of the match between what the target needs and what the operative provides is not coincidence. It is the output of the profiling process translated into a presented identity. The second method is called graduated disclosure. One of the primary mechanisms through which trust deepens in any relationship is mutual vulnerability. The experience of both parties progressively revealing more of themselves and finding that revelation received rather than rejected. The operative manages this process with careful calibration, disclosing personal information at a pace and depth that slightly precedes the target's own disclosures, creating a dynamic where the target is consistently in the position of responding to openness with openness rather than initiating it. This feels like natural intimacy building. It is the operative managing the depth of the relationship's development with precision, ensuring that each new level of disclosure by the target is preceded by an apparent act of trust from the operative that makes the target as disclosure feel like reciprocity rather than exposure. The target believes they are choosing how much to share. The operative is setting the pace. The third method is called anchor event construction. Lasting attachment in relationships is reinforced by shared experiences that carry emotional weight. Moments both parties remember as significant and that become reference points in the relationship's ongoing narrative. The operative engineers these anchor events deliberately. A conversation that goes somewhere genuinely unexpected and meaningful. A moment of apparent mutual vulnerability that feels like a turning point. A shared experience. A journey. A difficulty navigated together. A piece of news received in each other's company. That gives the relationship a history and a texture that makes it feel irreplaceable. These moments do not happen spontaneously. They are created through careful situational management, but they are experienced by the target as the organic accumulation of a real shared life. Together, these three methods build a relationship that the target experiences as one of the most genuine they have, which is, from an operational standpoint, precisely the point. There is a cost embedded in this category of intelligence operation that the operational reports do not capture, and that the institutional culture surrounding this work has historically had very little language for. It is not the cost to the target, though that cost is real and significant and will be returned to. It is the cost to the operative who is required across months or years of professional practice to be the engineered version of what a lonely person most needs. The operatives deployed in loneliness. Base cultivation operations are not selected for cold indifference to human connection. They are selected, in part, for their capacity for genuine warmth, for their ability to listen with real attention, to respond with real curiosity, to be present in a way that feels authentic because it is, in most of its surface expressions, genuinely authentic. The warmth that Thomas experienced from Richard was not performed in the way that acting is performed. It was warmth that was real in the moment of its expression, directed by an operational intention that the target never knew existed. The combination, genuine human warmth directed by deliberate operational intention, creates a specific psychological complexity for the operative that accumulates over time in ways that institutional support structures have rarely been equipped to address. Because the operative is not simply pretending to care, they are caring within the scope of each interaction, while simultaneously maintaining an operational awareness that defines the meaning of that caring in a way the target never has access to. Former operatives who have spoken about this category of work, usually in retirement and usually with significant circumspection, describe a particular kind of moral weight that does not appear in the operational documentation. It is the weight of knowing what the target does not know, of sitting across from someone who has reorganized their emotional life around your presence and understanding that the foundation of that reorganization is not what they believe it to be, of watching someone trust you with a specific quality of trust that only forms in people who have been isolated and then found, and knowing that you placed yourself in their isolation deliberately. Some describe the experience of genuine affection for targets that form despite the operational context. The human engagement required by the work is real enough, sustained across sufficient time. That's something recognizable as care develops regardless of the professional framing, and that care coexists with the operational reality in a way that produces, for some operatives, a moral dissonance that debrief processes and institutional support have consistently underestimated. The cost to the target when operations of this kind are eventually uncovered is different in character, but equally significant: the specific betrayal of a loneliness. Base recruitment is not simply the betrayal of trust. It is the betrayal of relief. The thing that was taken from the target was not information or access or professional loyalty. Those things were consequences. What was taken first was the experience of no longer being alone, and the discovery that that experience was engineered returns the target, not just to where they were before the operative arrived, but to somewhere significantly darker. Because now the isolation is the same, but it carries an additional knowledge that the relief from it was real enough to feel completely genuine, and false enough to have been built from a file. Thomas lost more than his clearance. He lost the only Thursday mornings that had felt like his. Thomas was eventually identified. The operation was reconstructed with the clinical thoroughness that post-compromise investigations bring to everything they touch. The isolation profile was found. The research that preceded Richard's first appearance was documented. The Thursday coffee shop was mapped. The graduated disclosure sequence was traced through the months of the relationship's development. Every element of the engineering was visible in retrospect with a clarity that made the sophistication of the process difficult to look at directly. What the investigators found most striking, and what one of them described in a professional paper that circulated within a limited distribution for several years afterward, was not the operational precision of what had been deployed against Thomas. It was how completely invisible that precision had been to a man who was, by every professional measure, among the most security-conscious individuals in his facility. Someone trained to recognize approaches someone alert to certain categories of suspicious behavior, someone who applied rigorous judgment to professional context every working day of his career. None of that training touched what happened to him, because none of it was calibrated for the specific vulnerability that the operation had targeted. His professional security training assumed that threats would arrive in professional forms, that the vectors of risk would be recognizable as vectors of risk, that the people who wanted access to what he knew would appear in context that his training had prepared him to scrutinize. Richard appeared in the part of Thomas's life that felt like it belonged to him, the part that existed outside the institution and therefore felt outside the institution's threats, the part where a man who was cold sat down across from someone warm and thought for the first time in a long time that the city he had moved to was beginning to feel like somewhere he could be. The most important thing the story of Thomas reveals is not about intelligence agencies, or operational tradecraft, or the specific mechanics of the loneliness vector. It is about the relationship between human need and human vulnerability, about the fact that the things we need most are the things we examine least carefully when they finally arrive, about the specific blindness that relief produces in people who have been waiting for it. Loneliness is not a character deficiency. It is a human condition. It arrives in the lives of intelligent, capable, professionally accomplished people as reliably as it arrives in anyone else's, and it produces, in all of them, the same neurological and emotional response when it is finally relieved, the same gratitude, the same accelerated attachment, the same instinct to protect and preserve the connection that ended the isolation. These are not weaknesses to be corrected. They are features of human experience to be understood. Understanding them does not make you invulnerable. It makes you more attentive to timing, to the specific quality of need that was present in you when a significant relationship began, to whether the relief that a person provided arrived with a precision that, examined carefully, matches your specific unmet needs more completely than random coincidence would predict. Thomas was not weak. He was human, and he was targeted precisely because of it. The file that described him as an isolation profile was not wrong about him. It was just the first document in his life that had ever been honest about how alone he actually was. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling truth of all.